Have you ever stopped to think about how a religious protest in 16th century Germany could possibly connect to the classic American story of the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving? I mean, it seems like a massive leap, right? But believe it or not, there's a direct line. So today, we're going to follow that exact story, all the way from a crisis of faith in Europe to the shores of a so-called New World. Let's dive in.
Okay, to really get this, you have to try and put yourself in the shoes of an average person living in Europe back in the 1500s. You go to church, you're looking for some comfort, maybe some hope, but instead you're just filled with pure terror. The priest is up there telling you you're a sinner and you're destined for the fires of hell. It's an absolutely terrifying prospect, and it's what set the stage for a total revolution of faith.
So you're faced with this overwhelming terror. What could you even do about it? Well, the church, it offered a solution, but it came with a pretty big catch. See, this wasn't just about faith anymore. For a lot of people in power, it had become all about money, creating a system that felt deeply, deeply corrupt to a growing number of folks.
This practice was known as selling indulgences, and it was simple, really. You could basically pay the church to have your sins forgiven. This practice made the church fabulously wealthy, but for ordinary people, it meant you were trying to buy your way into heaven while you could barely even feed your own family. And to one German monk in particular, this wasn't just unfair, it was a spiritual crime.
That monk's name was Martin Luther, and in the year 1517, he came up with a number, 95. Now, this wasn't just some random number. It was a list of 95 complaints, a direct public challenge to the church's authority and its most profitable business.
The heart of Luther's argument was actually pretty simple. Salvation can't be bought. He argued that forgiveness comes from faith in Jesus Christ, period. In 1517, he sent his 95 Theses to the church bishops. But, and this is the crucial part, thanks to the brand new technology of the printing press, his ideas spread, and he encouraged everyone to read the Bible for themselves. And guess what? When they did, they found that nowhere, absolutely nowhere, does it say you have to pay for forgiveness.
Luther's protest kicked off a massive movement we now call Protestantism. It spread like wildfire all across Europe, splintering into all these different groups. And for some, like a group called the English Separatists, just reforming the church wasn't enough. No, they wanted a complete and total break, a place where they could practice their faith freely, with zero interference. And it's that desire that ultimately puts a group of them on a tiny ship headed for America.
You know, this timeline really lays out the whole story, connecting the dots over 150 years. You can see this direct path from Luther's protest in Germany, to the Mayflower landing, to that famous first feast. And then you see how disturbingly quickly it all leads to violent conflict. It's all one continuous, really complicated story.
So who exactly were these people we call the Pilgrims? Well, it wasn't just a shipload of religious fanatics. Out of the roughly 100 people crammed onto the Mayflower, only about a third of them were actually these separatists looking for religious freedom. The rest, they were a mix of servants and farmers who were just hoping for a better life and a little economic opportunity.
Now, their journey didn't just end when they landed in December of 1620. Oh no. In a lot of ways, the hardest part was just beginning. They were totally unprepared, they got there way too late in the year to plant any crops, and they were staring down a brutal New England winter.
Just think about that number for a second. 102 people. That's how many souls set off from England on that incredibly dangerous voyage, just filled with hope for a new life in a new land.
And this is the stark reality of their first year. More than half of them died, not in some glorious battle, but from starvation and disease during that first awful winter. They were completely, utterly out of their element.
So when the few survivors stumbled upon a piece of land that was already cleared, they saw it as a miracle, a gift from God, divine providence. But the historical reality tells a much, much darker story. They were building their new home on the ruins of Patuxet, an indigenous village whose people had been completely wiped out by diseases brought by earlier European explorers.
And here's where the story takes one of its most incredible and, honestly, ironic turns. A man named Tisquantum, a member of that very same Patuxet people, who had actually been kidnapped and taken to Europe by previous explorers, he was the one who offered to help the settlers. Despite everything Europeans had done to him, he taught them how to farm the local crops. It was a choice that literally saved the remaining colonists' lives.
So thanks to Tisquantum's help, a fragile peace, a brief alliance, formed between the struggling colonists and their Wampanoag neighbors. It was this moment of cooperation, but it was one built on a very shaky foundation, a foundation that was about to crumble. By the fall of 1621, the survivors actually had a successful harvest, and they celebrated this moment of survival and good fortune with the Wampanoag people who had helped them get there. This is the event that would hundreds of years later become the basis for the American holiday of Thanksgiving.
But this visual shows you exactly why that peace was so fragile. That original little group of about 50 survivors was almost immediately followed by a massive flood of tens of thousands of new European colonizers. The power dynamic shifted dramatically and permanently. The land, and everything on it, was now seen as theirs for the taking.
And that leads us right to today, where the legacy of that arrival is, to put it mildly, contested. The very same day is remembered in two vastly different ways, reflecting two completely different sides of the same historical coin.
For many descendants of colonists, Thanksgiving is a beautiful celebration of survival, of harvest, and of peaceful beginnings. But for many indigenous Americans, it's marked as a national day of mourning, a solemn, painful reminder of the catastrophic loss of their people, their land, and their freedom that all started with that arrival.
Because that peace, it did not last. Just over 50 years after that first feast, the Wampanoag leader Metacom led a desperate war against the colonists to try and reclaim his people's rights. The colonists won, and as a brutal warning to anyone else who might resist, they displayed his head on a stake in the middle of Plymouth for 25 years, a gruesome symbol of the violent end of that brief alliance.
So that brings us to our final question for you to think about. When we see the entire chain of events, from a monk's protest for spiritual freedom in Germany, to a journey that led to colonization, a fleeting moment of peace, and then centuries of conflict, how does it change the way we think about these moments in history? It's a powerful reminder that no event ever happens in a vacuum, and the echoes of the past, well, they're always with us.